One of the great themes of the Jewish Bible is the theme of the Messianic Age. In the Jewish Bible, there are various passages which have long been read as predictions of a human special agent of God, an anointed one, that is, one chosen and empowered by God, especially commissioned by God. Anointed one is what the word Messiah means. This anointed one, this Messiah, is predicted to be a descendant of King David who will establish God's kingdom on earth, a new regime of total peace and justice. And everyone will worship the one true God. Idolatry will be left aside, and all the Jews will return to the land that was promised to the descendants of Abraham. The expectation of a Messiah was intense before, during, and after the lifetime of Jesus, so in and before the first century, Common Era. Messianic expectation has waxed and waned considerably since then. There have been periods where Jews were very excited that maybe the Messiah would come soon, and other periods where they were burnt out on the whole idea. Today, more traditional Jews regularly pray for the coming of the Messiah, whereas others disregard the doctrine entirely, or they reinterpret it as a golden age not brought about supernaturally by some special agent of God, but brought about just by political and social improvements that we can make by normal political and social means. The big dividing point between Christians and Jews is that Christians hold that this first century man, Jesus, was the Messiah, even though he did not immediately initiate this age of peace and justice. Christians think that he'll come back in the future and do that. Whereas some Jews bought into this, probably a majority of Palestinian Jews rejected Jesus. So ever since the first century, this has been the main sticking point between Jews and Christians. What does Judaism say about life after death? Traditional Judaism does believe in life after death, but oftentimes doesn't say very detailed things about it. The rabbis sometimes use vague talk about, quote, the world to come. Most modern Judaism is rather this worldly. It's focused on correct behavior here and now and the kind of things that we can do here and now, and not so much focused on trying to escape and to get to heaven or something like that, or even to focus on an afterlife with resurrection. But traditional Judaism, going way back, taught resurrection with a divine judgment of all people. This goes back to at least the 2nd century BCE. The doctrine of resurrection, as traditionally taught, has two stages. First of all, righteous Jews are raised to take part in the Messianic Age, and then later on, everyone is raised from the dead, and the righteous go into the world to come, and the unrighteous are in some sense doomed. They're damned in some sense. And they typically don't commit to exactly what that involves, whether that involves a hell of infinite suffering or just God making them cease to exist. Let's have a quick look then at the famous prophetic book in the Jewish Bible called Isaiah. Isaiah is believed to have been a real man, a prophet who lived in the last half of the 8th century BCE. And the book that bears his name, it's really considered a classic of world literature and not just the most beloved prophetic book within Judaism. This prophet Isaiah predicted the punishment of the Jews for their unfaithfulness to God, and then the restoration of a faithful remnant led by a chosen leader, the Messiah, although he's not called the Messiah in Isaiah. This will usher in the Messianic Age in which all people will worship the one true God. Scholars in modern times distinguish the man Isaiah from one they call Deutero-Isaiah, which just means second Isaiah. The theory, which is very popular in Jewish and Christian scholarship, is that chapters 1 through 39 of the book called Isaiah in the Jewish Bible actually derive from the historical Isaiah from the 8th century. And they hold that chapters 40 to 66 come from some later person whom they don't have a name for him, so they just make up the name second Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah. The most conservative scholars would not agree with this. They would say that despite stylistic differences and differences of vocabulary, all of this book is by the named person Isaiah. In chapter 1, God says through the prophet, "They have rebelled against me. They're a sinful nation. They have forsaken Yahweh. Alas," it says in verse 21, "she has become a harlot." God is calling his own special people a whore, a woman that can't be faithful to him, but has to give it up to whoever else, meaning the deities traditionally worshipped by the other peoples. Strong imagery, like I said. And God's not subtle, according to this prophet. In chapter 1, he says he's disgusted by their religious services, by their practices and festivals. God says, quote, I cannot endure them, end quote. In other words, he can't stand them. They make him sick. What he wants, he says, is for them to stop their evil doing, to do good, to defend justice, and to protect the most vulnerable people, such as widows and orphans. If you're going to be bad people, then he's not going to care about your religious service to him. This is the distinctive ethical voice of the Jewish prophets. While God is that harsh in a sense, he also tries to negotiate and offer forgiveness if they would but reconsider. He says, quote, come, let us reach an understanding. And if they can't reach an understanding, he threatens a punishment that will purify them of their evil. Chapter 5 has a passionate denouncement of unrighteousness. Even though God has done so much for them, they are drunks, they're corrupt, they call good evil and evil good. They think they're wise, but they're not wise. Quote, that is why the Lord's anger was roused against his people, end quote. And he promises to bring in a foreign army to maul and carry off the people like a lion attacking a deer. That's the threat that God is issuing to them. Chapter 6 features a terrifying vision of a holy, unique God on his throne. Isaiah sees a figure sitting on a throne. It's not really described much, other than that it's very big and impressive. Does this reflect the view that God is physical, that God has a body? It's possible. Some Jews and Christians have thought that. But this could also just be considered a theophany, an appearance of God. On this reading, the body, the figure on the throne that Isaiah sees in his vision would not be how God really is, but it would be a way that God appears. Very crudely, you could say it's sort of like a hologram that he puts out to represent himself to the prophet. In any case, in chapter 6, Isaiah is commissioned as a prophet by God. He's sent to warn God's chosen people of God's judgment, and if they won't listen, to curse them with blindness, that is, spiritual blindness, inability to understand God's purposes. Now, if we look over to a historical book in the Jewish Bible, the book of 2 Kings, these predictions come true. Chapter 21 recounts the reign of King Manasseh of Judah, who rules from Jerusalem. King Manasseh is an idolater, someone who personally worships and promotes the worship of the other deities of the surrounding nations by means of idols. He also, it says, practices divination, trying to foretell the future through magic means or trying to communicate with spirits or gods. It even says that he defiles the temple of Yahweh by setting up idols to other deities there. And to top it all off, he sacrifices his own son. There were, it seems, some elements within Canaanite religion where they practiced child sacrifice, where they would make a burnt offering of a baby or a small child. According to this chapter, he also murdered many people. He was a ruthless and unjust king. And in sum, he's just flouting the law of Moses. The law of Moses says not to do any of these things, and he's doing all of them. And it says that King Manasseh made Judah more evil than the nations God had helped them to take the land from originally after the Exodus. So that tears it. God's had it. Chapter 24. First, Judah becomes a vassal state to Babylon. Foolishly, the next king, Jehoiakim, rebels. But God is not with him. God is not on their side at this point. This results in warfare and chaos. And eventually, King Nebuchadnezzar II besieges and captures Jerusalem. He takes the entire court of the next king, Jehoiachin, to Babylon. Not only does he take the king and the king's court to Babylon, he takes the most important and the wealthiest residents away with him. He takes the cream of the crop, and he leaves only the poorest residents in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar also sets up his own king, Zedekiah. But in chapter 25, Zedekiah starts to feel like he's powerful and that Nebuchadnezzar is far away in Babylon, and he rebels. Thus, 9 years after these events, Nebuchadnezzar returns to Jerusalem and completely destroys the temple. Nebuchadnezzar murders the king Zedekiah's sons right in front of him, and then gouges the king's eyes out so that this is the last thing the king ever sees. And this horrible fate is presented as being the wrath of God, as the punishment of God for the Hebrews' unfaithfulness to him. As we saw in a previous lecture, the Assyrians had taken away the northern kingdom, and now the southern kingdom of Judah, those people are carried off into captivity in Babylon. It's not utter destruction, but it's a terrible wound and a terrible humiliation. It's a painful discipline of the Jewish people. That's how the prophets view it. Going back to Isaiah then, in chapters 42 to 44, and this is the part that many scholars believe is by a later prophet that somehow got attached to the original writings of Isaiah. In any case, the prophet here says, "This is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I have put my spirit upon him, and he shall teach the true way to the nations." Christians interpret this prediction to be about the Messiah, and some ancient Jews took it that way as well. However, a common Jewish reading of this whole section of Isaiah is that it's the whole nation of Israel that's being personified here as a single human being. It's the Jews who is this servant. It's the Jews who will show the true way to the nations. It's the Jews who are the chosen one, and who the book later says will be, quote, a light to the nations. Another important thing in this section of Isaiah is a strong declaration of monotheism. That there is only one God, properly speaking, and that's Yahweh. For this, you can see especially chapters 43 and 44. The prophet says that this is shown by the fact that only God, only Yahweh, can predict what's going to happen beforehand, whereas no other alleged deity can do this. It calls the other deities nothings and less than nothings. It isn't necessarily denying that there is any being at all that could answer to those names, but it is denying that any such beings have the same status as Yahweh, the one true God, the one creator, the one God who's always been around and who will always be around, and who is in charge of human history. Worship of idols is mocked and denigrated here. In chapter 44, the prophet says, quote, "The things they treasure can do no good. They neither look nor think," end quote. Chapter 44, it said that foolishly a craftsman will take a piece of wood and burn part of that wood to keep warm and to cook his food, and out of the rest of that wood will make a god, his own carving. And foolishly he prays to this thing which can neither hear him nor respond to him. He's too blind to realize that, quote, "the thing in my hand is a fraud," end quote. That is not a real God at all. Finally, in chapter 44, God promises to restore Jerusalem and its temple by means of King Cyrus. That is, Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, who eventually conquers Babylon and lets the Jews return. And Cyrus is actually named here. Traditional Jews and Christians, then, believe that this is a remarkable prophecy given hundreds of years before the return of the Jews from exile. And it's all the more remarkable for even having the king's proper name, Cyrus. Other people and other scholars view this as having been written after the fact. So the reason it has Cyrus's name is because it was actually written after Cyrus did these things. These are the ones who would attribute to a much later Deutero or second Isaiah. In our next and final lecture on Judaism, Jewish practices.